So it's Rafael Gutierrez, and I am going to use my lab manual, the Human Anatomy Clinical Approach. I'm going to use a lot of these pictures from there. I will be jumping around. So I'm actually jumping back so you can actually see certain things. Now, the first thing that I want you to pay attention to when you look at the heart is that you can, in the surface, you can already see a lot of the main areas. So we're going to call this area the anterior, and I have another one for the posterior. Now, big thing you'll notice is you have a couple depressions. You have a depression here, you have a depression coming around this way. This here, depression over here is going to be called your anterior interventricular. Think about it. Interventricular means between the ventricles. So it's your anterior interventricular sulcus. If you cut this in half, you'd have the septum. Over here, you have a depression between the atria and ventricles. Now, this little flap here is called the auricle. And so you have your auricle, which is where the atrium is, and then you have the ventricle here. You do have a lot of other things that we can talk about. We can talk about the pericardium, which is the sac around the heart, and we can talk about all the blood vessels. I'm going to start with the big blood vessels in the body. For that, I'm going to use a red pen, and what you'll notice is this is grayscale, so you can use different things. Now, the first arteries you see this big bulking artery called the aorta, and I'm making it red, but you have this aorta, which is this big arch here, and off the aorta you have these two vessels here and one over here, which are called your coronary arteries. As you have two of them, this right here is your right coronary artery, this right here is your left coronary artery. And you can see how this artery here goes between the ventricles, so it's your anterior interventricular artery, and it's going to end up feeding the tip of the heart. Now, this area of the heart is called the apex. You have another artery here which goes all the way around the heart, which is called the circumflex artery. Circumflex is one of the words you're going to know. The right and left coronary arteries go all the way around the heart, and they are connected by a circumflex artery, so it goes all the way around. If we go to the back of the heart here, you can again see the aorta coming up this way here, branches of the aorta here. The aorta is coming this way, and over here you have the thoracic aorta, which is the aorta as it's in the thoracic cavity. You can see these branches coming off here, which are your intercostal arteries. Now, there is another artery you can see coming off here, and you can see it here going pretty much. These would actually be going to the lungs, and these are your pulmonary arteries. So if we move over here, you can see that the pulmonary trunk, where the pulmonary arteries come off, is over here. And we do have some veins that you may want to actually pay attention to. One of them, I'm going to use blue, is this big vein here, which you notice drains into the right atrium, and this is called your superior vena cava. Down here you have another artery that comes in, which is your inferior vena cava. Now, last time we talked about the coronary sinus. We come over here and we have an area where all these veins come together here, and it drains into the heart. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick to the big vessels and show you how they're named. Now, the big one, again, you can see here is the aorta. Now, I always tell my students to remember they're A, B, C's. They're A, B, C's. A is for the aortic arch here. B is for brachiocephalic, this artery that comes off first. C is for common carotid here, and S is this one here, which is called the subclavian artery. Now, there is a secondary ABC, which is A, aorta, B, brachiocephalic. C would be this one here, which is your common carotid. This is your S, which is your subclavian. And so those are your ABCs, and again, you can see the intercostal arteries branch. Now, before you get there, you have the diaphragm here, and it separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And that's one of the big things that you want to actually pay attention to. Before we get into the abdominal cavity, we have two blood vessels that come off, which feed the diaphragm, which are called the phrenic arteries. Now, anytime you hear phrenic, it usually is going to have to do with the diaphragm. And over here, you can see the abdominal aorta coming down this way. You can see that one of the branches goes this way, and the other one comes here, which will go into the kidney. That's your renal artery. You also have a big branch here called the celiac trunk. Now, the celiac trunk is divided into a couple different branches, which I'll tell you about later, but what I wanted you to know is a celiac tends to refer to abdominal. Anytime you hear celiac, it's abdominal. Celiac trunk, you have the gastric artery, which is going to feed the stomach, the splenic artery, which is going to go to the spleen, and the common hepatic artery, which goes to the liver. Now, as you go past that, you have the superior mesenteric artery, and then you have two arteries that come off, and they're going to go to the pelvic region, which are called the gonadal arteries. Based on the name, you know that they're going to feed the gonads. Over here, you have your inferior mesenteric artery, and then you'll notice that your abdominal aorta splits. And this here is called your common iliac artery. The common iliac will branch. Anytime you see here common, it means it does branch. It's going to branch into the internal iliac, which goes in here, and the external, which is going to end up becoming the femoral artery when you get to the leg. One of the important things to note, I'm going to use green to show, is this bone here is the iliac crest. So the iliac artery is actually named for the location it's at. We now have pretty much most of the arteries of the abdominal cavity. Now, this is one of the first times I'm going to move on from this picture and go back. What you have is you have your ABCs here: aorta, brachiocephalic, common carotid, subclavian, or common carotid and subclavian. And this will actually be over here. We can see how the brachiocephalic branches into the common carotid here and branches off this way and forms this artery here, which goes inside the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae, going all the way up and eventually making it to the base of the skull, and it will eventually go into the brain. And so what you end up with is the vertebral artery coming off subclavian artery. The carotid artery here, common carotid, I want to show you somewhere else. You will remember this picture. It has a couple muscles that are important for you to find the carotid artery. One of them is actually missing, but we can draw it in here. And this here would be your sternocleidomastoid. The other muscle that you see right here, going from your scapula all the way up. And so you can see here your omohyoid, which is important. And then you have another muscle here, from the styloid process to the hyoid. And so what you have is you have a nice triangle here. And then this area here, right around here, is where you find your carotid artery. That's actually known as carotid triangle. That is one of the important areas to know for cardiovascular, so you can find the artery quick. Common carotid artery, which is going to branch into the internal and external carotid artery. The other place you do want to look at, we removed here an important muscle, which is your pectoralis major. You can see the coracobrachialis here, and underneath it here, you can see part of the subscapularis, and you can probably see a little bit, you'd be able to see a little bit here of the teres major. Now the reason that triangle is important is inside that region coming here, you have the axillary artery. The area is called the axilla. It's the armpit. And when you come here, you also see a depression between the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii. And in there, we have the artery changes name again, becoming the brachial artery. And it's the brachial artery all the way until it gets into the antecubital fossa, which is this area here, which we talked about before. You have this muscle here, which is called your pronator teres here, your brachioradialis here. And if you make a straight line from one epicondyle to the other, you have the triangle, which gives you the antecubital fossa. And in there, you have a blood vessel. And the blood vessel you have in there is the brachial artery, which branches into two. A radial artery, which is going to go deep, and you're going to feel it again on this side of the hand, and the ulnar, which you're going to feel on this side here, which these two together will form an arch in the palm of the hand, called the palmar arch. Actually, you'll have two. One is superficial, one is deep. Then you'll have the digital arteries coming off. In the new version of the book I'm making, I have a picture that shows this better, but that should be available in September 2017. The other thing that I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you in my hand how palmar arch works. Now, this is actually called the Allen's test. And if you make your fist and you open it up, your fingers turn pink relatively quick. But you have an artery here and here. If I were to make a fist and compress both arteries and open them up, what you notice is my fingers stay pale. If I let go of the radial artery, you notice that all 5 of them turn pink. If I do the same thing, tighten, press on the 2 arteries, open, and I release the ulnar, you notice that they all come. And that's called the Allen's test. And what it does is it checks the palmar arch. And that's one of the reasons why anatomy is so important, is to understand how these things work in clinic. Moving on to the leg. We do have the muscles that we've talked about before. You have the sartorius here, you have the adductor longus here, and you have a ligament here called the inguinal ligament, which gives you a nice triangle. And in that triangle, actually following the edge here, you have a major artery called the femoral artery. The femoral artery will branch into a lot of different arteries, which when you get the book, you'll actually be able to talk about which arteries go where. And what ends up happening is it ends up going deep and going back. Now, I have the picture here, which works out pretty good, because as you come here, you maintain the artery there. And it, as you know, are in the popliteal fossa. The name of the artery there will be the popliteal artery. And you have your glenocular arteries coming out there, and it ends up splitting. And one of the arteries comes to the front, and it's called the anterior tibial artery. In the back, tibial-fibular trunk, which branches into the fibular artery and the posterior tibial artery, which would run down the back of the leg here, deep to this muscle. The one that's really important to look at is this one here, which I drew in here, which is your anterior tibial artery. And it ends up getting a new name called the dorsal pedis, and the dorsal pedis makes an arch here. arcuate arteries of the foot, digital arteries too. Now this area here is really important to feel the pulse in, especially in diabetics, because a lot of diabetics do not have good circulation and they can end up losing the blood supply to the feet. And if you're not careful, if you don't watch the blood supply to the feet in a diabetic, sometimes they will start losing limbs, foot, toes, mostly here. Going back to the heart, we now can also talk about the veins. Now the veins are coming back in the heart, and as you know, remember, they're bigger than the arteries that branch to it. The best thing to see is a lot of these veins are actually named for the arteries that they're next to. Now one thing you notice is they are paired. So the right side and left side will have certain thing. This is your internal jugular vein, external jugular vein here. And this here is your subclavian where it comes in. Subclavian is here too. And so these two parts here, which I'm coloring in blue, are your brachiocephalic veins. And they drain into a tube here, which is called your superior vena cava. You have an inferior underneath, which you can barely see on this picture. You also do have another artery that I want to mention, and that's this artery here, which I am making blue because it's deoxygenated blood. It's called the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries, and it goes back to the heart through the pulmonary veins found in this picture. Now, what you see is a specialized vein. You have a lot of veins that are, again, they're named after the organs they're touching. They are named for the arteries that's next to it. And what you see is, you see this big organ here. This big organ on this side here is your liver. Over here you have another big bag organ, which is your spleen. Your stomach would be up here, and your pancreas will be going from the spleen to the liver like that. To the gallbladder here as well, which is more important for digestion. But what you have is you have actually a specialized venous system here, which really helps explain the physiology of a lot of things that end up happening. One of the things that happens is you have a vein coming here. As it's coming from the spleen, it's called the splenic vein. Over here, you have a vein coming to the intestines, which we call the mesenteric vein. This one's actually the bigger one, so we call it the superior mesenteric vein, next to the superior mesenteric artery. Then you have here another one, which we call the inferior mesenteric vein. And these are feeding taking the blood from the intestine and bringing it to the liver. What that means is if you have a big meal, a lot of sugar or a lot of amino acids, they end up, the food stuff first, before it goes anywhere else, it goes to the liver. And so that actually keeps your body from massive high and low fluctuations of sugar. It also is a reason why your liver is not dependent on insulin for its uptake of glucose. It's actually, and it pretty much is a concentration. So as the concentration is high, it will absorb more sugar. This is supposed to be a basic understanding. There are a couple other things we can talk about. We can talk about blood and what blood cells look like. I'm going to do lymphatics next time. Hopefully this is enough for you, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. Thank you and good night. If you are interested in the lab manual, you can order it on Amazon. It's look at my name, which my name is actually on it. Anything I write is actually going to be the R.H. Gutierrez MD. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you just a basic introduction of anatomy where you can go quickly. Hope this makes sense to you and hope that you decide to continue on this path. Goodbye.